Hey, hey, hey. So, I haven't thrown a podcast up in a little bit. Uh, had a conference that I went to. Um, been busy with a few things, but I am back now. So, I'd like to open up with some less than happy news. The wrestler Scott Hall has passed away at the age of 63. Um, I've thrown out two short little videos, one updating when he was put on life support, and the other when he was taken off life support. So feel free to give either of those videos a view. And there's many really good tributes that have been pouring out. Cultaholic Wrestling had one that was particularly nice, and I expect Hannibal TV will probably throw a good one out too. He's pretty good about that stuff. So, with that being said, um, the first thing I would like to talk about is something called Ong's Hat in New Jersey. Now, it is a real place, and it's very much discussed in the paranormal world. So, a lot of this is going to come from Lucia from The Ghost in My Machine, which is a very interesting website with that covers creepypastas. Now, if you search Ong's Hat on Wikipedia, you'll not find one. You will find two different articles. Because when we talk about Ong's Hat, there's really two separate things. There's the place itself, which is a small remote location in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, where the New Jersey Devil lives. And, which is the one I'm going to focus on, sort of a vast conspiracy, this strange institute conducting odd experiments and possibly dimensional travel or time travel through this mysterious device called the egg. Now, just to put everything out front, this is a collaborative fiction project of which the conspiracy, the institute, the experiments, and the egg are all story elements. This is before alternate reality games. This is before creepypastas. Um, in many ways, it's the first creepypasta. It even predates Jeff the Killer. So, seeing as this is so collaborative and it's been passed from one author to another to another to 1,000,010 YouTube channels, it gets a little complicated. So, first, let's briefly touch upon Ong's Hat, the place. Now, was it a fully fledged town? Maybe. Maybe it was just a small collection of huts. But in 1936, the writer Henry Charlton Beck described it in his book, Forgotten Towns of Southern New Jersey. He claimed it had once been a happening place. And then in 1944, 8 years later, in Jersey Genesis, he said that everything he had written about Ong's Hat, he now knows to be false. It's called a ghost town that's located within or near Pemberton Township, New Jersey. But there's nothing there now. Although, if you go there today, there is a road that bears its name. But it's between Magnolia and Ridge roads. in the Brendan T. Byrne State Forest. Okay. So, who is Ong? And what the fuck's with his hat? Well, the first one is pretty simple. Jacob Ong, a colonizer whose family arrived in the area sometime during the 17th century. Now, as for the hat, well, it may not have originally been a hat at all. In fact, it has been theorized that Ong's hat is a corruption of Ong's hut, referring to a temporary shelter by the Ongs on their way from the shore to Burlington County during the 1600s. The possibility was raised in a letter to the editor published in New York Times on June 30th, 1968. In it, a Ross K. Cook of East Orange, New Jersey, who claimed to be a descendant of the Ong family, sought to correct an old and erroneous fable that had been repeated in the paper. Let's see. Can I save that image? No. Fucking hell. As a member of the Ong family, I would like to say that the town of Ong's Hat is a misnomer. The Ongs were Quakers and settled in Little Egg Harbor, Burlington County, early in the 17th century. They were down at the shore and had to take their grain up to Burlington to be grounded by bagging it and slinging the bags over the backs of their horses. Halfway to Burlington, they stopped overnight to break the journey and built a small shelter at what is now Ong's Hat, but was originally called Ong's Hut. However, there are other explanations for the name Ong's Hat. Now, they are mostly legend, but in many cases, variations on the same legend have been passed about. Now, one of the more popular ones is Jacob Ong was a particularly snappy dresser, and he habitually wore a very fine silk hat. Now, one day, someone who many have claimed to be a jealous lover, some have said was an irritated dance partner, they grabbed the hat in a fit of anger and stomped it flat. Ong, upset at this unfortunate turn of events, took the hat and flung it in the air where it snagged on the branches of a tree, stuck tight, and remained there for several years as some sort of unofficial marker of this unknown town's location. Ergo, it became Ong's Hat. Now, there's also the mention of the possibility that a local tavern owner used the symbol of a hat to denote his establishment, either by drawing it on a sign or throwing a hat in a tree himself, although that seems slightly less likely. Now, all of these stories are folklore, but it is worth noting, as far as I know, Cook's claim has never been verified. That doesn't mean it isn't true. It just means that the story of Ong's Hut is his word against everyone else's. Now, there is still some history to be found. The location itself was established in 1778. We know this because a map of Hessian settlements in the area has Ongs clearly marked on it, just southeast of New Mill. And the historical record supports the existence of Jacob Ong too. We know that the Ong family came over to the Massachusetts Bay Colony from Bristol, England in 1631, and later on, parts of the family arrived in New Jersey. The Jacob Ong in question, who was just one of several Jacobs to have been born to the Ong family, was born sometime around 1672. Then, in 1700, he bought 100 acres of land. In that area is the place known as Ong's Hat. But Ong's Hat wouldn't be much more than a mild oddity with an unusual name. Think of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. Now, whether it had been a small town or nothing more than a hut? We don't know. If it weren't for the Incunabula papers, I'm probably saying that wrong. So if someone knows the pronunciation for that, please toss that in the comments. Anyways, this is where we get all the other things we talk about. You see, the site said to have once belonged to Ong's Hat is also said to have belonged to a jazz musician named Wally Ford, or Faird, or Fard. A lot of discrepancies here. Now, in 1978, he bought the land, 200 acres of it, on which he established the Moorish Science Ashram. But once a number of scientists, some who had, it was said, spent time at institutes as illustrious as Princeton University, the ashram became something more. In fact, it was the first institute for chaos studies, which about a decade into its tenure developed a device called the egg, which, although not its intended purpose, did seem to facilitate dimensional travel. With it, humans could visit an alternate timeline, an alternate Earth. Think of the multiverse and the Marvel Universe. At least, that's what some pamphlets and other assorted pieces of writing that began circulating in the 1980s would have you believe. Initially available through the mail, as in you would spot an ad for them. You would, if you wanted to know more, you'd write to an address and receive these documents before making their way to bulletin boards in the early internet gathering spots. These pieces of writing together make up what Joseph Matheny, one of Ong's Hat's, the Incunabula papers' key architects, calls an early attempt to utilize the internet as a fluid medium for storytelling across multiple media platforms, and an interdisciplinary avant-garde media art project. Because although it overlaps with some actual history and some actual science, which is one of the things that makes it so fucking believable, that's all it is. It's a piece of storytelling. It's fiction. The Moorish Science Ashram, the Institute for Chaos Studies, the Egg. None of it exists. But Ong's Hat does. Now, Ong's Hat and the Incunabula papers are what we tend to think of now as an ARG. Now, the first major modern ARG is arguably 2001's The Beast, which is a tie-in with the film AI, Artificial Intelligence. But Ong's Hat is often pointed as a major precursor to The Beast. Now, also, I would like to add that it is a form of creepypasta, which of course is copypasta. For years, actually for decades, an awful lot of people thought this was real. People would even go on trips to Ong's Hat, the place, in search of the weird interdimensional mystery, hoping to find the remains of the ashram or evidence of the egg. They would gather online and discuss their findings, or lack thereof. Some additional stories emerged from people who claim to have grown up in Ong's Hat, or to have survived the ashram or the Chaos Institute. Now, many of these people were created by people, many of these stories were written by people other than Matheny, and other than his co-collaborator, Nick Hebert, or Herbert. But that's where some of the problems inherent in the project become apparent. In many ways, it can be viewed as a case study, as a warning. What happens when an ARG or fictional storytelling project gets away from its creators? After things started to get a little too close for comfort, Matheny and Herbert pulled the plug, announcing in 2001, the Ong's Hat project has now concluded. The announcement concluded with a postscript reading, "This is not a joke." However, some people think it's still going. And in many ways, it is still going. I'm talking about it right now. Some think that the announcement was just part of the game because people were getting too close. And some think that it's horrifyingly real and the announcement was just a cover-up. And those who are knee-deep or even waist or chest deep, you'll never be able to convince them otherwise. After all, from their perspective, you could be part of the conspiracy. Someone sent to lead them astray, to get them off the trail. And maybe they just need to look a little harder. Pretty interesting. Hey, how you doing? Fresh news? 24/7. But that's what ARGs came from. Things like Cicada, which may or may not be real, who knows. All of these things, these ARGs, which I'm a big fan of ARGs or unfiction, because they're not all ARGs. I was a big fan of a few stories that weren't games. They were just alternate versions, alternate ways of telling stories, which in many ways Ong's Hat was, but it turned into a game, people investigating. But let me know what you think about the Ong's Hat mystery. I find it neat. Now, unfortunately, the next topic is not going to be as positive or happy. I would like to discuss Jamal al-Fadl. Now, this is an Al-Qaeda terrorist. February 6th, 2001 was a historic day in the U.S. judicial system. Although it would take 7 months and a week until people realized how historic this day would be. It was day 2 of proceedings in the United States versus Osama bin Laden, a criminal prosecution related to the bombing of 2 U.S. embassies in Africa that no one seemed to care about. The trial promised to be a real snoozer, so the government wasted no time in bringing out its star witness. The witness was Jamal al-Fadl, and he proceeded to tell the story of his life, how he got mixed up in a strange little cult no one had ever heard of, going by the funny name of Al-Qaeda. Now, his tale was certainly self-serving and riddled with omissions, notably of al-Fadl's self-proclaimed innocence of directly taking part in any specific terrorist attack. But much of his story has been verified, and other sources have filled many of the gaps. But to this day, al-Fadl's story is the best available public account of the origins of Al-Qaeda, and the most detailed descriptions of how the group transforms aimless young men into bloodthirsty, holy warriors. This is a story of an organization that is both political and religious, equal parts corporation and cult. It is an employer that once provided comprehensive health benefits for its workers, while still being a terrorist cabal that shows no mercy towards its enemies. Its members were expected to conform to the strictest tenets of Islam but they pledged to abandon these tenets in a moment, if so ordered. Al-Fadl's account is a tale of nearly endless contradictions within the organization he joined and then betrayed, and within the heart of the man himself. Jamal was a Sudanese national born near Khartoum in 1963 to an affluent family. He was married off at an early age, but he wasn't up to the responsibility. On graduation from high school, he traveled to Saudi Arabia, where he lived, somewhat improbably, as an idle pothead. But the kingdom was the wrong place for alternative lifestyles. Jamal and Ted's excellent adventures came to an end when his roommate was busted for possession. 2 years in prison, but he fortunately escaped flogging. So Al-Fadl hit the road looking for a land more friendly to his marijuana use. So in 1968, he washed up on the shores of the United States, along with your typical huddled masses. Al-Fadl arrived in Brooklyn first, then drifted shiftlessly about the country with stops in Georgia, where he studied to improve his English. In Georgia? Have you been to Georgia? And North Kakalaki, also known as Carolina. Finally, he returned to Brooklyn, where he achieved the American dream, a glamorous job working in a grocery store. I've been there. One day, a couple of Muslim customers suggested he stop by the Al Farouk Mosque on Atlantic Avenue, an unlikely destination for a harmless donor. The Saudi-funded mosque embraced fundamentalist Islam, which required a few adjustments from Jamal, like no more weed. But like many wayward youths, the 23-year-old drifter found a new sense of direction and purpose in religion. He began working evenings at the mosque. Fortunately, there were plenty of jobs. Al Farouk was the bustling center of a massive operation supporting a Muslim holy war against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Funds, and sometimes weapons or other materials, were raised in the U.S. and around the world, funneled through Al Farouk, and then forwarded to Afghanistan, where they were received by Osama bin Laden and other Muslims engaged in a holy war, with the explicit assistance of the CIA and other branches of the United States government. Now, Al-Fadl began his jihad career as a glorified bagman. He helped raise and carry cash for the Mujahideen, money which was sent to Afghanistan through a wide variety of avenues. Al-Fadl also recruited Muslims to join up with the Services Office, an organized effort to support the Afghan jihad. And then unto the breach. The Imam of Al Farouk, Mustafa Shalabi, was an Egyptian who once served in a terror cell with Ayman al-Zawahiri, head of the terrorist group Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Yes, I chose something that has a lot of difficult names and words to pronounce, so my apologies if I get them wrong, but if I get them right, no one will, give me a big high five, right? But you should. Anyways, towards the end of the 1980s, Shalabi ordered Al-Fadl to Peshawar, Pakistan. Been there. Where a new life was waiting for him. He packed his bags and left his second wife behind. Al-Fadl and 4 others flew to Pakistan on Shalabi's dime. At the hotel, a man came to them who gave them an inspirational talk about the war. He told them 5 would-be warriors that they would be going to a guest house where they would leave all their belongings and adopt a new name in cult-like fashion. With nothing but his new name, Abu Bakr Sudani, and the clothes on his back, Jamal traveled to an al-Qaeda training camp in Afghanistan, known as Khalid ibn Walid. For 45 days, he was trained in the use of weapons, small arms, automatic, and rocket-propelled grenades, with enough kick to take out a tank, helicopter, or an airplane. But not Rosie O'Donnell. From there, it was a series of disorienting environments. At guest houses, the recruits gathered to absorb the inspirational teachings of Osama bin Laden himself, and other eminent theologians, such as Mahmoud Salim, who would later distinguish himself by throwing pepper sauce into the eyes of an American prison guard, then gouge out one of the same eyes with a sharpened tip of a comb. heads stuffed full of jihadist teachings, the trainees. Through the veil. The trainees were then packed off to the front lines for a large helping of blood, guts, and adrenaline, followed by more training and religious indoctrination. By moving the trainees around constantly, their sense of isolation and disorientation was steadily increased, making them more and more receptive to the extreme religion Al Qaeda's founders espoused. By now, Jamal had been conditioned deeply enough to begin learning the nuts and bolts of how Al Qaeda ran and exactly what it did. He was taught how to run a camp himself, how to train others, how to keep books on Al Qaeda personnel. At some point in all of this, Jamal stopped being just one of the many Mujahideen warriors taking part in a conflict that the world generally supported and started to become a bona fide terrorist. He had learned war, he had learned religion, he had learned administration. Now all he needed was to learn how to make bombs. So the big picture. Training covered practical issues regarding Al Qaeda operations, its agenda, and its organization. The primary authority was the Shura Council, Consulting Council, which set policy, issued religious rulings, and chose the targets for the new jihad. The council was Al Qaeda's top authority, wielding its operational and ideological power to shape the young organization into a focused unit. The Shura Council included Zawahiri, bin Laden, Sheikh Saeed al-Masri, Dr. Fadel al-Masri, yes, Abu Musad al-Suri, and a whole bunch of people that al-Fadl only knew by their aliases. Now, situated around the Shura Council were several committees covering various aspects of the missions: military, economic, media, religious, jurisprudence. The military committee was headed by Abu Ubaidah al-Banshari. The media committee had a newspaper, Nashrat al-Akbar, the newscast. The editor's alias was Abu Musab Reuter, proving that even terrorists can have a sense of humor. Reuters. Anyways, the commitment to jihad was also laid out in writing. Some of the papers al-Fadl saw were propaganda and religious exhortation. Others laid out the parameters of jihad, including the principles of absolute obedience, eternal vigilance, endless patience. Still, others were contracts, oaths of loyalty known as bayat, which members of the inner circle were often required to sign. Now, again, invoking cult-like techniques, the bayat vow required extraordinary commitment from followers. If a follower was told to go anywhere in the world or cooperate with any other group, he was obliged to obey, even if the order was haram, forbidden under circumstances by Islamic law. In this, Al-Qaeda's leaders were following the tradition dating back to the Assassins. The philosophy had also been resurrected in modern times by an Egyptian cult known as Al-Takfir wal-Hijra, whose adherents included another man al-Fadl met during his time, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Now, around the end of 1989, al-Fadl took the oath, and he was off to create jihad on the world. His first assignment as a professional terrorist was in Egypt. He was instructed to shave his beard, wear Western clothes, and leave his Quran at home. An instructor told him to wear cologne and pack cigarettes to further create the impression he was a secular traveler. He say if somebody in custom he going to see the cologne and he see the cigarettes, he not going to think you an Islamic group or anything like. His travel papers were also a lie. Al-Qaeda's financial committee had a dedicated office that specialized in identity fraud, visas, identification, everything a terrorist might need to get through immigration. There were instructions on how to deal with customs. If his bags were inspected, if all else fails, the best way is offer a bribe. They tell you if when you go over there to airport and the customs they try to open your bag and ask you questions, you have to be nice and smile. And don't carry anything, bring the attention, El Fadl said. If you brought cigarettes with you, let them see. If you have cologne, let them see. They ask you, tell them I have come for visit. Don't talk about religion, jihad, about anything belonging to Islamic law or Islamic study. The Egypt trip was a simple courier job, delivering letters to 2 unknown recipients in Cairo. But his next expedition to the Sudan was an important one in the history of al-Qaeda. After the withdrawal of the Soviets, Afghanistan had evolved into a series of battles between various factions, each of whom saw themselves as the rightful rulers of the land. While things were getting bogged down there, the government of Sudan came under the control of Islamic fundamentalists. Sudan was also considerably more accessible than Afghanistan. While the civil war played itself out, many leaders felt al-Qaeda could thrive in Sudan. Bin Laden sent a team to investigate, led by Salim the Eye Gouger, Abu Rida al-Suri, also known as Mohammed Bayezid, a Syrian-American from Kansas City. The delegation met with Hassan al-Turabi, leader of the National Islamic Front, the political party which controlled Sudan. Like al-Qaeda, the NIF had been seeded by the Muslim Brotherhood out of Egypt. It was a good fit, and the move was approved. As a native, he was sent to Sudan as part of the first wave. Because he was a Sudanese national, he could buy property without any messy complications. So he starts this process in 1989. The full-scale process of moving al-Qaeda's home base began in 1990. Now, his responsibilities included renting houses and farms where the incoming Mujahideen would set up. Once the initial sites were identified, he was tasked to find more permanent facilities. See, the glare on my head is just too much, so I have to wear a hat. Anyways, the farmhouse Zawahiri finance was used to train Egyptian Islamic Jihad members. The complications of working in Sudan as opposed to the sparsely populated Afghanistan became apparent when their bomb-building exercises prompted neighboring residents to call the police. Al-Fadl was arrested, and he told the police to call Sudan's intelligence service. The spooks took over the investigation, but still jailed him briefly. The deal, they explained, was that the farm was only supposed to be used for refresher courses. Live explosives were over the line. It was smoothed out. Al-Qaeda loaned al-Fadl to Sudanese intelligence the following year to help interrogate would-be immigrants who claimed to have trained in Afghanistan. That way they could only get good terrorists into the country. So, like any other multinational corporation, al-Qaeda had an office suite. Osama bin Laden had the corner office, of course, based out of Khartoum. Al-Qaeda's headquarters operation employed receptionists, secretaries, accountants, bureaucrats. Subsidiary companies had their own CEOs, like the Taliban. Al-Qaeda ran factories and a tannery, which the Sudanese government gave the group after it wouldn't repay a loan from bin Laden. They gave him a tannery, yeah. Al-Qaeda made sesame oil, palm oil, furniture, soap. It imported and exported peanuts and sunflower seeds. The farms grew wheat, corn, beans, fruits, and vegetables. Bin Laden owned a cattle breeding company and a bakery. Yes. Now, compared to his countrymen, al-Fadl was quite affluent. The average income in Sudan was less than $50 per month, whereas he was making $500 a month. But for someone routinely handling suitcases full of cash and brokering deals that often reached 6 figures, the size of his paycheck was remarkably small. Sometimes he would ask for advances to make ends meet. For all the sophistication of al-Qaeda's corporate operations and cult indoctrination techniques, the terrorist network had failed to grasp a basic principle of management. You don't pay low salaries to people who handle large amounts of money. It was a oversight that will cost them greatly. Khartoum was not Afghanistan. The isolation and disorientation that served al-Qaeda so well in the hills of Afghanistan could not be sustained in Sudan's urban milieu. The problem was especially keen for Jamal, who had returned to his homeland and re-established contact with his family. After his trip in the strange, surreal world of the Afghan training camps, he is suddenly thrust into an environment laden with reminders of his old life and old habits, and mundane worries about friends and money and family and security. Despite a series of religious retreats, refresher training courses, and bin Laden's weekly lectures on jihad and religion, lectures that had begun to take on a distinctly anti-American tone, he was being consumed by the 9-to-5 grind, which has filled many and much less exotic lines of work. One of his many, many responsibilities was paying out the salaries to al-Qaeda's members and employees. In that course of the job, he couldn't help but notice other terrorists were making a lot more than he was. Some made $800 a month, some made $1,500 a month, some even more. One operative in particular, Abu Abdallah Lubani, made far, far more than anyone else. Lubani, whose real name was Wadi el-Hajj, was an American citizen and one of bin Laden's most trusted aides. If Jamal especially resented el-Hajj, he didn't let on, though. By the end, he would have the last laugh. His revenge on el-Hajj would exceed the wildest dreams of even the most resentful corporate drones. Now, I'm going to pause there for just a moment. I am thinking of a movie like Office Space, right? Only they're terrorists. Right? Now, I know you couldn't get this movie made anymore because nothing with any humor is allowed to exist in modern times, unfortunately. But imagine if it could. Get some writers together, that'll make it into a stage play. Could be brilliant. Brilliant, I says. Now, as his frustration grew, al-Fadl complained to bin Laden about the salary disparities, purportedly on behalf of others, but mostly on behalf of himself. Now, although he enjoyed substantial benefits as a member of al-Qaeda, bin Laden had bought him a house in 1992, he felt he deserved a raise. And a big one at that. Bin Laden's response didn't make him feel very good at all. He says some people, they traveling a lot and they do more work. And also they got chance to work in the country. Some people, they got citizenship from another country and they go back over there for regular life. And they can make more money than in group. He says that's why he tried to make them happy and give them more money. Now that didn't make him feel very good. He made more money as a grocery store clerk in Brooklyn. The message was clear. Other people work harder than you. Other people more valuable than you. Other people get paid more than you. Shut up, get back to work. Although bin Laden did do one thing right. He took him off payroll duty. But the damage had been done. In 1992, el-Hajj came to Sudan, and Jamal was given the privilege of working with a man who made so much more money than he did. They'd met before in Afghanistan, but el-Hajj hadn't made much of an impression at the time. In a bitter irony, he was tasked to teach el-Hajj how to do aspects of his own job. Now, the relationship wasn't comfortable. On one occasion, in the Sudan offices, el-Hajj instructed al-Fadl to buy a shipment of bicycles from Azerbaijan. He argued that the bikes were cheap. and Al Qaeda could resell them to raise money. He didn't mince words saying so. I'm the third one. I'm the third person who signed the contract to join Al Qaeda, and you should tell me what's going on over there? Why are you hiding something from me? He asked. El-Haj didn't deign to reply. He just smiled and he didn't say anything. And his resentment grew. Al-Qaeda's leader was turning his ideological attention increasingly towards the United States. In 1991 and 92, his lectures began to focus on American forces in the Persian Gulf. Bin Laden had especially resented the U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia. The Shura Council gathered to discuss this new focus and to craft fatwas that supported the extension of jihad to Western shores. But even as Al-Qaeda was planning to hit the U.S. government, other governments had set their sights on Al-Qaeda. Al-Fadl was warned that foreign governments were attempting to infiltrate the terrorist network. Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, a military commander, and others told him about the threat. They also told him how they dealt with it. 2 informants had been jailed and another had been killed. Al-Qaeda struck at the Americans in Somalia, providing training and support to the rebels down there, who shot down a Black Hawk helicopter. Although he had been put on standby, he never went to Somalia himself. Or so he later claimed when staring down the barrel of criminal prosecution. He knew other people who had. Abu Talha al-Sudani came to Al-Fadl on his return from Somalia, flush with cash, and asked him to help him buy a house with the bonus money he'd been paid by Al-Qaeda. While others reaped the rewards and claimed the glory, Jamal was working a desk job. After leaving Afghanistan, he could never again directly engage an enemy in combat, or so he claimed. Instead, he was consigned to the Dilbert hole of administrative work, albeit with that special terrorist twist. He traveled to Kenya, Pakistan, Budapest, Croatia, Bosnia, Jordan, and Eritrea, amongst other places. Sometimes he carried money on those trips, both in and out of Sudan. Other times he carried letters. On another occasion, he smuggled guns into Egypt, concealed among a herd of camels. Eventually, some aspect of his activities came to the attention of the Egyptian authorities. Zawahiri sent word back to Khartoum that Al-Fadl was never to set foot in Egypt again, even if it was just on a layover. The amounts of money continued to increase. He was given $100,000 in a bag to carry from Sudan to Jordan. He carried or escorted 5- and 6-figure amounts of cash to jihadists around the world. His duties were expanded to include many Al-Qaeda financing operations. Still supporting his family on $6,000 annual salary, he was given access to millions in bin Laden's bank accounts. The temptation finally was too much for him to bear. He began to steal from bin Laden. Now, Al-Fadl met a wide swath of humanity while working for Al-Qaeda. The network's members and employees came from all over the world, virtually every race and nationality. One member even had Israeli citizenship. And the list of countries where they had significant members in operations was nothing short of staggering, from Yemen to Italy to Pakistan, Nigeria, France, Chechnya. Germany, Oman, Great Britain, Bosnia, Canada, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, the Philippines. Manila is a very big place for Al-Qaeda. Tajikistan, been there. Even the United States, especially from the United States. Other terrorist groups work with Al-Qaeda in many of these countries, and some collectively made the Bayat Oath. Although the Western media sometimes portrays Al-Qaeda as a group of random killers, the group has keen focus. The bulk of the aforementioned operations were explicitly devoted to overthrowing existing governments and replacing them with Islamic governments. In a few countries so westernized that this goal was impracticable, Al-Qaeda simply intended to hurt the government and keep on hurting them until they became so demoralized that they removed themselves from those regions Al-Qaeda deemed to be Muslim lands. To accomplish this, They collaborated with other groups all over the world. Islamic group, Egyptian jihadists, headed by the blind sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, an ally of bin Laden, and Zawahiri. Now, conveniently, El Hajj arrived in town just a few hours before Shalabi was murdered. If al-Fadl had suspicions about who had killed his old mentor, he kept them to himself, though. Mustafa Shalabi. The murder was never solved, but its most immediate consequence was to firmly align al-Farouq with al-Qaeda in both ideology and operation. With Rahman ensconced to the al-Farouq Mosque, al-Qaeda was now in position to take its jihad to the United States. As Rahman's followers began to lay plans for a terrorist attack on U.S. soil, Jamal al-Fadl was diving ever deeper into al-Qaeda's terrorist agenda. Towards the end of 1993, the head of al-Qaeda's financial committee called al-Fadl with a new assignment, his biggest to date. He told me, "We hear somebody in Khartoum, he got uranium, and we need you to go and study that. Is that true or not?" The seller was a former president of Sudan. The asking price was $1.5 million, plus a commission for the two middlemen. Al-Fadl investigated the claim and set up a meeting. Bayezid was brought in to oversee the operation, along with Abu Musab al-Suri, a red-headed expert in weapons of mass destruction who had become a member of the Shura Council. Returning to al-Fadl, Bayezid rattled off a list of criteria the uranium would have to meet before the purchase could proceed. The questions were detailed and knowledgeable. This was no idle dalliance. It was only one phase in an ongoing campaign to obtain weapons of mass destruction. Bayezid attended the next meetings with the seller's representatives. After switching cars, the small group traveled to a house where they brought out a cylinder 2 to 3 feet tall. Going over all the technical information. Okay, that's good. They returned to al-Qaeda's offices. Bayezid filled out what appeared to be a requisition, which Fadl took to Mahmoud Salim for approval. Salim signed off on the request. Al-Fadl set up another meeting with the seller's representative, a man named Bashir. The deal was on, but they wanted to test the uranium using a machine they would import from Kenya. After this exchange, he was given $10,000, and he was not involved in any further activity regarding the uranium purchase. He said he didn't know if it was ever completed. The account doesn't add up, of course. If the purchase did not proceed, why was he given a $10,000 payment? Was it a middleman commission, or was it intended for al-Qaeda's coffers, just one in a number of thefts by the ever more resentful, low-wage terrorist worker? U.S. authorities later captured or questioned most of the al-Qaeda operatives involved in the uranium deal. It is believed the sale was never completed, but that's not for sure. Now, in 1993, jihad arrived in America in the form of a truck bomb planted beneath the World Trade Center. With Rahman's guidance, a group of terrorists from various backgrounds had coalesced into two separate but closely linked cells. The first cell struck in February when it executed the Trade Center bombing under the operational control of Ramzi Youssef, who al-Fadl had met during his early training in Afghanistan. A few months later, the second cell prepared to strike, but its planned day of terror was foiled by the FBI, which had placed an informant in the group. The plotters were arrested, and Rahman was arrested as their leader. Al-Qaeda provided support for both plots. As part of Rahman's trial, prosecutors released a long list of unindicated co-conspirators, including Osama bin Laden, his brother-in-law, Mohammed Jamal Khalifa, and several other al-Qaeda members. An emergency meeting was called when the news of Rahman's arrest arrived in al-Qaeda's Sudan headquarters, but no action came of it. Some of al-Qaeda's members resigned in protest. Others took action under the auspices of affiliated groups. Bin Laden promised that something would be done, but not until later, because Al-Qaeda remained focused on its primary goal. Now, Jamal had become a parasite on Al-Qaeda's terrorist operations. During his time in Sudan, he handled some of Al-Qaeda's legitimate business transactions, purchases of sugar and oil, and they were all resold for profit to the Sudanese. But he began skimming commissions off the purchases, which were funded by a combination of Al-Qaeda and bin Laden's personal bank accounts. Eventually, his commissions totaled more than $110,000. According to him, probably a low-end estimate. He used the money to buy real estate for his sister and himself, and he even bought a car. When his customers started complaining to headquarters that he was charging commissions on Al-Qaeda's transactions, the financial committee confronted him with the allegations. He denied them, but then the charges were repeated by other customers, trusted customers. Finally, he confessed. The officials were appalled. One of Al-Qaeda's original members. This betrayal was inconceivable. He apologized and offered to repay the money. They asked why. Osama bin Laden, they told him, wanted to know why. He launched into a tirade. Others had done what he did. The Egyptians had done it. The Egyptians got the best of everything. They got higher salaries than al-Fadl. Everyone got higher salaries. And he was a senior member. Who deserved it more than he? They were not impressed. It was agreed he would pay back the money. He produced about $30,000, but then said he couldn't get any more. Not good enough. If he paid back half, they would consider letting him pay the rest in installments. Any alternative to this proposal would have to be approved by bin Laden. Now, although he still owned most of the properties he had bought using the money, he continued to insist that repayment was impossible. He asked the financier to set up a meeting, and it was set up the very next week. Now, this dude could have a movie made about his life. I know it might be a little dry, me reading this, but I find it interesting. And that's what the Rambling Podcast is, me talking about things I find interesting. I know, to go from a creepypasta to the life story of a terrorist, but yeah. So bin Laden told Jamal, I don't care about the money, but I care about you because you've been with us from the beginning. You worked hard in Afghanistan. You were one of the best people in Al-Qaeda, according to Jamal. We want to know. We give you a salary. We give you everything. When you travel, we give you extra money. We pay your medical bills. Why you did that? Why did you need the money for? Did someone outside of Al-Qaeda put you up to it? He repeated his complaints about the Egyptians, and he repeated his complaints about the inequities. People with less seniority made what he did. Bin Laden was a picture of wounded sincerity, as al-Fadl remembered it. There's no reason for you to do that. If you need money, you should come to us. You should speak with me and tell me I want to buy a house. I want to change my car. And you didn't do that. You just stole the money. He did not answer whether, he did not say whether a tiny tear of sorrow and betrayal was in the corner of bin Laden. Poor Osama. I ask you to forgive, al-Fadl said. I want to be part of Al-Qaeda again. I want to continue. There is no forgiveness until you bring all the money back. I cannot do that. If I say okay, that means everyone else in Al-Qaeda will accept your reason for taking the money. Go do your best and give all the money back. After that, everything will be fine. But there's no money left. I can't forgive you until you give all the money back. And that was it. That was the meeting. So he tried to talk to the financial chairman. Same fucking thing. So their solution was they sent him to Syria, where he asked for help from the United Nations. They gave him some money to live, but nothing else. He went to Jordan, where he asked an Al-Qaeda member he knew there to help him resolve the dispute. Nothing. He tried to go to Israel, on the theory that Israelis hated the Sudanese National Islamic Front enough to help him, but he never made it across the border. In Lebanon, he tried to sell a book. The publisher was too greedy. 7 years earlier, he had devoted his whole life to the cause of jihad. Now his only cause was money. He landed in Eritrea and repeated the routine. This time he approached local Al-Qaeda affiliate and tried fruitlessly to interest them in funding a Sudanese opposition group. When they passed, he went to where the real money is: Saudi Arabia. There he tried to win support for opposing bin Laden, who by this time had fallen out of favor with his home government. He was received by senior members of the Saudi intelligence who were politely disinterested. Instead, they cheerfully suggested he assassinate bin Laden. He cheerfully replied that he would be happy to undertake the task with the assistance of relatives back in Sudan, but they didn't offer any cash up front. So in the summer of 1996, the Saudis sent him back to Eritrea and told him to sit tight, then report to their embassy there. He didn't like the plan they had proposed, which would have him traveling back to Pakistan at great personal risk. Even worse, he began to suspect that the Saudis would give most of their money to his Sudanese relatives and cut him out of the loop. Despairing of the ever-elusive paycheck, al-Fadl finally set his sails toward his berth of last resort. The greatest enemy was the United States. Perhaps the Americans would protect him. I went to American embassy in Eritrea, and I went to the visa line. He waited his turn. I have some information for your government, and if your government will help me, I have information about people. They want to do something against your government. Asked to take a seat. After 20 minutes, he was sent to a back office. What type of information are you offering? I was in Afghanistan. I worked with a group, and I know those people. They're trying to make war against our country. Maybe they try to do something inside the United States, and they try to fight United States Army outside. And they also make bomb against embassy outside. The woman told him to come back Wednesday. When he did, much more specific questions. He answered them all. Come back on Friday. Then U.S. intelligence agents were waiting for him with even more questions. Days and days. He answered everything. Never told them he stole money from Al-Qaeda. They pressed him, saying they knew about something he had done in Sudan. Finally, he confessed. He gave them hundreds of names of people linked to Al-Qaeda. Some they asked about, others he volunteered. After weeks of back and forth, they were satisfied they had a person of value on their hands. He was shuttled off to Europe. There, U.S. Attorney Patrick Fitzgerald and FBI agent Danny Coleman flew to meet with the man who would soon become their star witness. al-Fadl was shocked he continued to meet with these people, enemies of Islam, the people upon whom he had worked to unleash nuclear Armageddon. You know, you really don't have horns in your head. After negotiations, he agreed to come to the U.S. with no agreement in place. In a leap of faith, he entrusted himself to the American criminal justice system to do everything the prosecutors asked of him. In November of 1996, he put his pledge in writing, trusting the system would reward him for the information he offered. The system would not let him down. al-Fadl pleaded guilty to multiple counts of conspiracy against the United States with a maximum sentence of 15 years. He didn't have a firm agreement regarding his sentence, but sentencing was deferred while he cooperated with officials in their investigation of Al-Qaeda. For nearly 2 years, he was kept in custody by the FBI, which watched him 24 hours a day. He was moved into the Witness Protection Program. They arranged to have his Sudanese family flown to the U.S. to join him in hiding. They covered his living expenses and those of his family. The bills for his upkeep would extend into hundreds of thousands of dollars with no end in sight. Despite all of this, nothing happened for months on end. He talked and the government listened. Prosecutors had a witness, but they had no case. On August 7th, 1998, U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, were attacked with truck bombs, resulting in the deaths of 213 people. Very few were actually Americans. 6 suspects were arrested, including American citizen and Special Forces veterans Ali Muhammad, Mamdouh Mahmoud Salim, Mohammed Sadiq O'Day, Muhammad Rashid Daoud Al-Owakali, Kalfan Khamis Muhammad, and one overpaid Egyptian, Wadi El-Hajj. Salim and Ali Muhammad had their cases broken away from the primary case, which would bear the fateful name of U.S. versus Osama bin Laden. Salim's case was separated after the aforementioned eye stabbing incident. Ali Muhammad's case was handled separately because, well, you'd actually have to read that one to believe it. But he had finally hit the jackpot. He could get his revenge on Hage and get paid to do it. He came out on the second day of the trial and stayed for several days, telling his long and convoluted story. His role as a witness was sometimes questionable, between his admitted love for money, the government's humongous bills for supporting him and his family, and the fuzzy nature of his recollections. However, he did better than the other al-Qaeda informant who testified during the trial. When he identified El-Hage to an interrogator as an al-Qaeda member, I did not tell him the entire truth. My aim was to have him get me out of my jail cell. Inconsistencies or no, El-Hage and other 3 defendants were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. 3 were convicted on murder charges. El-Hage was convicted only on conspiracy, since no one ever connected him to the bombings proper. Al-Fadl had done his duty. Now he awaited his reward. Would his sentence be 0 years or 15? Now, the U.S. versus bin Laden wasn't even an early contender for trial of the 21st century. Not when viewed against such highlights as the O.J. Simpson trial. But then, everything changed. Al-Fadl was in the catbird seat. Just a couple months earlier, he'd been a small fish playing a vital role in a complicated case that had already been largely forgotten. He's also a felon, having entered a guilty plea to conspiracy to injure and destroy national defense material, premises and facilities of the United States, and conspiracy to carry an explosive during the commission of a felony. His sentence was supposed to be somewhere between 0 and 15 years, depending on how useful he made himself. Al-Fadl being Al-Fadl, he somehow managed to negotiate a $20,000 loan from the U.S. government on top of the sentencing deal. And all of this was before the main event. On September 12th, Jamal Al-Fadl was suddenly a national treasure. His sentencing was just forgotten. Now, he'd been arrested, and despite 6 years as his right-hand man, his services were too much in demand. In addition to new visitors from intelligence agencies and the military, there were new cases in which his testimony was sought, such as the government's prosecution of the president of the Benevolence International Foundation. Al-Fadl's star turn was aborted by plea deals at the last minute. To this day, Al-Fadl has never seen the inside of a jail cell, and there's a good chance he never will. The value of his testimony to the historical record is significant, but there is serious question whether his value to prosecutors justifies the substantial cost of his upkeep. Al-Fadl's greatest achievement, the conviction of El-Hajj and 3 others for the African embassy bombings, teetered on the verge of falling apart when it was revealed that U.S. Marshal Service had withheld hours of videotape recordings of his conversations with FBI agents. The chats covered his immigration status, about his inability to find a job, his prospects for 0 jail time, in short, the 1,000,001 reasons why he might want to tilt his testimony. The presiding judge in the case denied El-Hajj's bid for a new trial, but in a harshly worded ruling, he savaged the marshals, for a mixture of inaction, incompetence, and stonewalling, and an attempted cover-up, while urging the defendant to appeal, which he has since done. An overturned conviction would not mark a glorious note on which to end El Fado's career, but then he's not exactly a glorious guy. The pothead turned terrorist paper pusher turned embezzler turned snitch is going to live out his days churning up increasingly inane bits of trivia just to keep the dogs at bay. At least until he wears out his welcome or banks up the witness protection program. A swift deportation followed by a drive-by shooting will most likely follow, although he could alternately end up in a secret prison at an undisclosed location. Either way, he's not exactly making his mother proud. And with that long diatribe, I will close this podcast off with always remember, no matter who you are, no matter what you have done in life, no matter what you plan to do, ramen noodles are fantastic, and I love eating them. It's my words of advice. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great evening. And I'm going to try to get some sleep because I have to paint a house tomorrow. Have a good one. Like and subscribe and do all that stuff. And rest in peace, Scott Hall. And William Hurt.